Alright, let's talk about how to calculate the angle between two vectors. First of all, what is the angle between two vectors? Well, if this is a vector and you want to calculate the angle between it and another vector, you should join the vectors at their initial points. And like with adding, you join the tip of this vector to the tail of the next. Well, it's not the same thing if you want to calculate the angle. So let's say we've got two vectors that look something like this. Then the angle between those two vectors would be the angle right here. Okay? So one way to do it would be to draw in the components of each vector as right triangles. And then you could find the components of each vector. And once you've got the components found, you could find the angle inside this vector, this lower vector here, inside the right triangle. And you could find the angle from here down to the horizontal for the other vector. And then to calculate the angle between them, remember that's the angle right here, you could take the difference of those two angles. Okay, so that's one way to calculate the angle between two vectors, especially if it's an acute angle. Now let's say you have an obtuse angle between two vectors, so it might look something like this. Then you may want to draw the components in again, like this. Figure out what the components of each vector are, then that would help you to find these angles inside each right triangle. And then the angle between the vectors would be this angle right here, which you could then find, because all three of these angles would have to add up to 180, you could easily find this middle angle if you knew the two red angles. Okay, so that's a general strategy on calculating the angle between two vectors without really needing to know anything new. But a quicker way to find it is to use the dot product of two vectors. So the cosine of the angle theta between two vectors is the dot product of the vectors, which is an easy number to calculate, divided by the magnitude of vector u times the magnitude of vector v. Magnitudes are also very easy to calculate. And then to find the angle theta between the two vectors, you take the inverse cosine of both sides. So let's do an example. I want to calculate the angle between the vector 4, -2 and -3, -3, and I've drawn the picture here. So we're trying to find this angle right here. And so we could do it using how I mentioned before, find each of the angles in the right triangles, and then realize that all three of the angles would have to add up to 180 to find the blue angle. Or you can do this formula up here as well. So using the formula, we could see that theta would be the inverse cosine of the dot product of u and v, the two vectors. So the dot product would be 4 times -3, that's -12. -2 times -3 is positive 6, so we've got a -12 plus a positive 6, so the dot product is -6. So that's the numerator. The dot product is on top. Divided by the product of the magnitude of each of these. Well, the magnitude of this vector would be the square root of 4 squared plus -2 squared. So we have the square root of 20 times the square root of -3 squared 9 plus another 9, so the square root of 18. Okay, so we need to take the inverse cosine, and we've already got the angle we need. This equals 108.4 degrees approximately. And I'll just throw a disclaimer out there. I don't have my calculator with me, so I'm trying to use a rather poor calculator online to get this number, so it's very well that I may have entered this incorrectly or something, but I do believe it makes sense because this is definitely an obtuse angle, and it seems to be a reasonable answer as well.